And welcome back to the International Symposium. My name is Chad Hoseth. I'm the Director of International Initiatives in the Office of International Programs at Colorado State University. And this session explores the global reaction to the coronavirus global pandemic, with obviously a special focus on what China did and did not do right in their handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. Joining us today are two remarkable thought leaders who will share their perspectives from both a political and scientific lens. First, Dr. Mei Chu is a clinical professor in the Department of Epidemiology at the Colorado School of Public Health. She also works as a senior technical consultant for USAID and the World Health Organization. And last February, Dr. Chu joined the WHO Experts Group for Infection Control and Prevention of the COVID-19 epidemic. Dr. Sam Zhao is professor and director of the Center for China-U.S. Cooperation at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver. Sam is also founding editor of the Journal of Contemporary China. Let me add here that while we all miss meeting in person, these online sessions also allow for innovations in collaboration and access to these types of programs. And we're especially pleased to be jointly organizing today's session with the Center for China-U.S. Cooperation at DU. We welcome our CCUC members who are in today's audience and encourage everyone to check out CCUC for more great programs and content on the complex relationship between China and the United States. Today's session will start with remarks and discussion from our two panelists, but we will reserve ample time for audience questions, so please submit your questions in the Q&A box. I refer you to the closed captioning box as well at the lower part of your screen. And at this point, I will turn the program over to you, Mei and Sam, and leave it in your capable hands to have a fruitful discussion. Thank you so much.
So thank you. I think maybe I could go first and give you the scientific and the ideas, and then Sam can then wrap it up in the policy and its impact. So I'm going to share my screen. And thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. It is a very interesting panel, and I think it will be a very useful panel for us to have a look at some of the things that we have learned recently. So I'm going to go ahead and open this up. Are you seeing do I need to swap displays? Looks like I should, huh? Is this better?
Yeah, it's very good.
Okay, so I'm going to start. So thank you again and for inviting me. And I'm going to try and do this as quickly, but give you an overview. This is from this morning's New York Times, and it shows the number of cases around the world, and that the greatest burden is United States at this moment for the average new cases per day, followed by UK, Europe, South Africa, Brazil, and the rest of the world. And that it is clear that the burden is heaviest here, and that the rest of the world, including China, is towards the bottom where they have most of the transmission under control. A quick view of what SARS coronavirus is. It's a zoonotic disease. Its natural host is unknown. It's genetically linked to bat viruses. And some of the dynamics of the disease transmission and cases is presented here. I won't speak to too much of it, but the fact is that one of the goals is the R0, which is this particular area right here. We want to make sure that at its height, that means one person can transmit to 2.5 persons. Our goal is to reach to one person transmitting to less than one person, or that is, we stop the transmission. High risk is still 60-year-olds and higher and comorbidity. But what is really interesting in the year that since this has emerged, that we found that 59% of the cases are often transmitted by people who show no signs and symptoms of disease. They say they're healthy, they have no fever, they have no signs, but yet they are transmitters. And in this case, some of the children are actually the transmitters of disease. So at the moment, we also know the documented locations when transmission occurs is in hospitals, healthcare workers, patients, EMR, and in the community where there's indoor gathering, churches, or densely packed places. And at the moment, and also we are now able to say that they're authorized vaccines and therapeutics that we can use. So where does this come from? It comes from originally, so this is the SARS coronavirus 2. And if you look at the lineage in this simplified scheme, it's from bats to different animals, and this is SARS coronavirus 2. Previously, in 2003, SARS coronavirus 1 came through, we believe, civet cats in the wet markets in China and led to this particular virus. They're very similar. And then another form of it from bats went into camels and some Middle Eastern respiratory virus, which is another SARS virus. And then somehow they jumped from those species to man and then caused infections. So we can see that very closely, this is where we are. It's as close at 91% similarity in sequence. This is why we say it's of potential bat origin. And this bat origin was discovered in China. This is the Institute of some infamy at this moment. It's the only high containment facility in China. It was built as a China-France cooperative project. The way this institute runs is it receives a multinational funding, including the United States, and that they have a very extensive program in zoonotic or animal studies, and they are part of the Global One Health Initiative. So their work is important and their discoveries are important. But here on the upper left corner, you see that there's all kinds of rumors and other questions about this, but there is no evidence that the SARS coronavirus 2 escaped from this institute, and that this is the work of this institute, which is well known around the world and supported by many countries. So I'm going to switch change topics here for a minute, because I want to really talk about, besides the origin and the science background of that virus, is that another piece that China has played heavily in this pandemic is that in the WHO records, as you see here that I captured, it says that every month WHO sends around the world 89 million masks, 30 million gowns, 1.6 million goggles, 76 million pairs of gloves, and many, many liters of hand sanitizer. And all this has to be supplied by somebody from somewhere. And WHO is responsible for getting these to countries, especially where it's low resource and they cannot buy it for themselves or produce it themselves. So where's all this produced by? And this is a WHO graph. So you can see China owns 76% of the source of all the PPE that is being used in our hospitals, in our emergency rooms and elsewhere. And that very few other countries actually are even close to this. And this being Malaysia and some of the Southeast Asian countries and India, but very, very little elsewhere. And the US is really that white block there, or North America. So we depend on China for the source. The other thing that's happened since the emergence of this pandemic in 2000 or January 2020 is that the market was very quickly flooded with COVID-19 test kits. China produces over 60% of these listed kits, and China also aggressively market or distributes these either as a diplomacy effort or as a source of very reasonably priced test kits. But in general, the compliance of these kits to the international regulatory requirements remains uneven. So the quality is still is something of a challenge. The other piece that China has done is in the vaccine race, as you might know, we do have two validated, one that's used in the United States and soon to have a third, which is this the Johnson & Johnson vaccine that's being discussed in the news today. But there are different types. There's some Chinese developed vaccine. Here is Sputnik, the Russian developed vaccine. And then here are some other Chinese vaccines being produced in the India vaccine. So it's very rapid, it's very quick. So for instance, last November, there were only 11 on this phase 3 trial, which is the critical trial to make sure it's safe and efficacious. As of January 21st, last month, we had 20 of those. So it increased by 100, many percent for vaccine available. And China has a large market and they're donating this around the world and being used, as is Russia. So finally, I'll just end up with something little to bring a little smile to the cross-cultural context of this conference, is that Chinese political and cultural messages usually are posted as slogans on red banners, originating during the Mao era, and they've been used for decades to promote government policies and statutes as family planning and so forth. So in the COVID outbreak, which emerged last year during the Chinese Lunar New Year in January and early February of 2020, most of these, Chinese government was concerned with the spread of the disease. And so they put these up throughout the city, and I just have a few selection. So definitely mask wearing is important in China. And this is one of the banners that says that even Chinese gods have to wear masks. So this epidemic is no joke. Then because of the Lunar New Year migration, which is very important in Chinese culture, the slogan was trying to get people not to come home or go home and take the disease, so that they said, if you went home to visit your parents, you're not going to make your parents happen. And then you're going to bear the burden of the conscience of bringing the disease to them. And finally, they also knew that this is potentially from animals. So it says that don't touch animals, the viruses can jump on you anytime. My very last slide is just a thank you to the healthcare workers around the world who have really borne the brunt of this response. And I look forward to some of your questions and sharing some more ideas. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Chu, for the very thorough and insightful analysis from the scientific perspective as a specialist. I'm going to talk from a very different angle, because the COVID has caused modern knives hold, and also is a modern scientific issue, and has a very significant geopolitical, geostrategic consequences, especially when we talk about China, US has somehow being rendered very heavy blue for the global leadership. And China as a rising power, in fact, has been confirmed its status during this process. We all remember that when the virus started early last year, I still remember in January, I went to Taiwan at that time, very beginning January. People were talking about that, about the cover up everything. And there were newspaper articles talking about the virus as China's Chernobyl moment, and the legitimacy of the Communist Party would be threatened, and also with geopolitical consequences during the trade war between U.S. and China. However, the Chernobyl moment never came to China. In fact, the leadership quickly realized the scale and the scaring consequence of the virus, and took a very consequential and very decisive action and decision, which only China could take as authoritarian one-party state. On January 23rd, they quarantined the huge city of 1.1 million, 11 million population, Wuhan, as an epicenter. Then they extended this quickly to the whole nation, the other provinces, and 1.4 billion population. And people were told to stay at home, and all the transportation were closed, and the universities, everything, anywhere, banks, everything was closed. And President Xi Jinping launched the so-called People's Wall, have a big propaganda, even having the community policing, having residents to monitor each other, to report each other. And also they used all the technology. In fact, China was criticized as using those electronic surveillance equipments to monitor their own people. But this time they use that to monitor people's contacts with the virus and with whatever. And the temperature station was set up everywhere in China, and people were assigned those codes: green, yellow, and red. The green code was the only one you could go anywhere if you are allowed to go to anywhere. And the government really took such a strong and stringent methods unseen in history. Even we talk about Mao Zedong era time, this has not been seen in PRC history or in the whole world, and which delivered. In fact, only a couple months after the case, we now talk about vaccine. At that time was no vaccine, just use those kind of a mask and to force people stay at home. And the virus somehow not only reduced, somehow was disappeared in China quickly. I still remember March 18th, January 23rd to March 18th, only less than 2 months, China reported 0 new cases. And on April 17th, they reported 0 deaths from the virus. Then April 8th, the next day, the 76 days of lockdown of the Wuhan city was lifted. And so it's a huge accomplishment, which could not be anticipated in January. It could be accomplished only by these very powerful, very strong one-party authoritarian state. After China controlled the, using those force, controlled the spread of the virus in China, China began to launch propaganda offense, to try to whitewash the initial cover-up and all those problems from very beginning, and also try to fight back against international communities, what they call stabilization of China, which is very impressive, that propaganda campaign, which start from what people now are familiar with, the blame game. In fact, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson, Zhao Lijian, same last name as mine, but we have no relationship, even blamed the U.S. brought the virus to Wuhan during October the year before, a military game. And the Chinese media, I was so impressed at that time, was so controlled, tight controlled by government, went viral to criticize America and other countries for the criticism of China's initial actions. And in the meantime, China launched what I think Dr. Chu mentioned, those mask diplomacy, because China produced a huge percentage of those equipments, including mask. They call mask diplomacy because the mask was the symbol at that time, and tried to tell the world that China was a responsible power. And the European countries, especially European countries and other countries, still ravaged by the virus, needed China's assistance. And also, they not only provide those assistance, they also demanded the gratitude from those countries. One scholar described the arrival, all those leaders of those countries, Chinese ambassadors in those countries, presented with a ceremony. All those countries thanked China another aspect China launched during this process was to prove or to try to tell the world the authoritarian one-party system was more superior than Western democracies. In fact, the comparison from Chinese perspective was so clear that the disorganized U.S. European democracies could not work, cannot control these virus, and cannot mobilize people to comply and also mobilize resources to fight. And they only knew how to blame other countries, WHO or China. And the Chinese government was much more effective, much more organized, and Chinese people was much more in compliance with the Chinese government. So the governance issue they talk about doesn't matter if it's a democracy or one-party authoritarian system. Governance is the key. So the Chinese government to the world, and particularly the Chinese people, I think is more targeted at domestic audience, that the Communist Party leadership was very effective. You should be grateful for the one-party mobilization capacity to have this governance during the crisis. Without Communist Party, the things will be out of control. You see what happened in the United States and also in the European countries. So they really tried to tell the world that China was such a wonderful place. And also the Chinese diplomats during that time was, for quite a while, China diplomats become increasingly aggressive, and known as wolf warrior diplomats. But these wolf warrior diplomats met news, known to the whole world, and they just fought back on any country who were not grateful to China or who were not respectful to China. These efforts really was, for me, was very impressive. I use term kind of diplomatic offensive during the crisis to promote China's national interests. And this offensive has continued. In fact, even the 2021, if the 2020, the catch word or the puzzle word was mask diplomacy. In the 2021 now, in the last couple of months, we can see is a vaccine diplomacy. And China has really boosted its capacity to produce the vaccines to the lower income countries, developing countries, partially because the developed countries, US, European countries, just focused all those supplies domestically and did not provide for those third world countries. Although China's vaccine may not be as good, but it's only available vaccines to those developing countries, even some European countries, Serbia, Hungary, and they became the first Eastern European country or first EU country. Hungary was the first EU country to massively roll out the Chinese Sinopharm vaccine, and UAE has used really a good amount of them. And China now has, if you read Chinese Global Times or those Chinese newspapers, China has pressed that their products are better than American, the Pfizer, which I just had last week. I'm going to the second one next week. I don't know, I'm a little bit nervous. But they said they are much better, safer, and also effective than Americans because they use inactive, those kind of virus, which they said is traditional, have been so many years in practice, and they know what they are. And also they could Xi Jinping I think last July already announced to the world that Chinese vaccine will be the global public goods, providing to the third world countries. So this propaganda, this offensive has going on ever since, I think last March, last April. However, what are the consequences? How do we understand the Chinese so-called success? I will see, first of all, I will say that indeed, although it's impressive, China controlled the virus, but at a very high price. If people really want to live in China, I don't think I want to live in that environment, as Dr. Chu showed those banners and also the community monitoring, all those kind of situation. Second, I don't know if all those products all are public goods. In fact, Chinese mask diplomacy to a great extent backfired during that time, because some of them are not really for free. A lot of them were sold at a high price, and also some of them the qualities were not good, especially Finland. And in fact, they fired their senior official purchasing China's deficit equipments. And also in China at that time, for first time, the Guangzhou had so many African people. They really discriminated those people, and all the African ambassadors called upon the Chinese foreign minister to protest. That's the first time we see those African countries, China's friends, to protest the Chinese government policy. And also the propaganda targeting domestic audience, giving people the impression that the whole offense equipment, supplies, everything were strategically to serve China's strategic interests. That's what they told the Chinese people. Had string attached in that case. And so for some countries, they were really concerned about the Chinese propaganda, Chinese assistance. Another consequence, another big problem for me to look at this was the competition with the United States. Not only those blame game against the United States, but a rivalry between China and the US. These virus, COVID, was a global threat, global public health threat. And it's different from those so-called traditional security threat. It's not a zero-sum. It's a lose-lose. If we don't control that, everybody is a loser, no winner in this process. But both countries, especially in the China case, because they try to tell the world now they are solution, not the cause. And so this kind of geopolitical rival between China and the US has really prevented the global collaboration to deal with this global non-traditional threat to the international community. One good example, let me give you a good example, was in the past, UN had a track record to mobilize resources globally to fight this public health threat. I think 10 years ago, when HIV was a threat, the UN under US leadership passed resolution in the UN Security Council to mobilize international resources. 10 years ago, when Ebola outbreak, the UN Security Council also passed a resolution, which I think is maybe symbolic, but there's a kind of binding international law effects to mobilize resources. But this time, we did not see any action. This is such a huge global disaster. But UN Security Council did nothing. Why? Because in last March, China was the president of UN Security Council, routine president, and China refused to have that. And US also dragged the leg because the US said, yes, we should pass a resolution to name it Chinese virus. China said, see, you politicize this. And next month, I think Estonia, a small European country, was the routine chair. It tried to promote a resolution. But in the resolution, they wrote transparency was important. Then China said, no, this is your criticism of our action. So the UN did nothing. The only role is the WHO, which is important, which has played a very important role, but was under attack by the US for quite a while, the Trump administration. They even withdraw from WHO, stopped funding to WHO. And also WHO itself has a limited capacity. The good example now is the vaccine issue. The WHO has put together with European Union have COVAX, which is supposed to be a global collective efforts to equally distribute vaccines. But what happened? It has not been effective at all. And the European countries and the rich countries, they have not supported that much. And its capacity has been kind of seen as a charity organization, which I think is strange there. And even if it works, they cannot even provide more than 20% of the global need. I just read some articles by the African countries. They could not get anything from COVAX or from any other countries. Now they go to China. Go to China. I don't know if that's what they want. Finally, I think here is that the world is in a disorder. I mean, in good old days, US would, as a global leader, would work, take responsibility to work with other countries and multilateral international organizations to fight this type of virus, but US has not taken that role. Even I don't think the Joe Biden administration has taken responsibility yet. And I don't think China is in a position yet to overtake the US leadership to provide those sweeping global public goods. And so the world is in the dangers of global disorder. Some scholars use the term global zero, G0, to describe the current world moving toward the jungle of woods. That Chinese said 丛林法则. And even another scholar even used the term G-2, because smaller countries are active, try to use their own resources and work with each other. And but the two big powers, U.S. China, have not taken good leadership role. So this is a very concerning situation in the world because of China-U.S. rivalry in this global pandemic crisis. We are in dangers of failure. I mean, I don't know how long we can get out of this. I hope we can get this out very soon. Even the US, we all got herd immunity. If those African countries, other countries don't get it, we're still in trouble. Okay, I stop here. I don't want to take too much of time.
Thank you so much for both of your outstanding and insightful thoughts. But let me kind of build on where you just ended, Sam, and invite May to respond. My quick reaction is you are painting a fairly gloomy picture, right? Global disorder and sort of painting a picture of geopolitical forces trumping any opportunity for what I'd kind of call more of a holistic or global approach to solving the pandemic that's in front of us. May, given your kind of insight and influence working with the World Health Organization, is that do you share that assessment? Or are you more optimistic that we may be able to break through some of the geopolitical adversarial relationship we have and move towards a more one world approach towards addressing the pandemic?
Well, thank you. You give me the hard question, right? So it is very complex, of course, you know, that's what it is. But I think when Dr. Zhou talked about the COVAX, I think that is a bright spot. It is not realized at this moment because vaccines are just becoming available, right? But I think in the next 3, 4, 5 years, that coalition is going to be quite productive. The Biden administration just announced earlier or late last week that they're committing $4 billion towards COVAX and committing millions of doses of vaccine for the public good through the COVAX, which is organized and led through a coalition, including WHO. China has already, I believe, put in about 100 million doses of vaccine committed to COVAX. So I think countries are putting it in and trying to bring that together. And it's an interesting partnership of politicians, public health scientists, industry, and people who really want to do good. So I'm optimistic that would help. But after all that, COVAX only will allow each country to vaccinate enough for the top 12%, and each country has to decide which of the 12% get vaccinated in the first round. And so it could be very inequitable and being heavily criticized because of this simple formula that they put in, because certainly 12% in one country is very different from 12% in another country. So, but I think as a public good effort, it is probably the best that we have. And I think it's one area that we can will it to work better or walk away from it. So it's really up to our governments how they want to do this. But both China and United States are committed to COVAX. Okay.
Sam?
I agree.
And I'll just add, and were we to move towards a more sort of optimistic view that Dr. Chu is talking about, what would be required both in the United States and in China for us to be able to move towards a more collaborative approach?
I think Dr. Chu's optimistic about COVAX is a very important aspect that U.S. China have both committed to this connective good, and but I don't think that's enough yet. As Dr. Chu mentioned that if at the best estimate, they could only provide 20% of the vaccines to the world population is far from 70% of the requirement for the herd immunity. And so US and China as the two largest powers, they should provide more public goods, even pledge more to this type of organization. I'm so glad now US has returned to the WHO and is going to pay back its dues. I think that's a very important first step. And also these two countries have to really work within those multilateral framework to provide, the UN framework to provide more global public goods on this. And also I think these two countries should also provide some kind of bilateral assistance. In fact, now when I say catchword is vaccine diplomacy, because these countries now, they use these vaccines to advance their strategic and economic interests. I just read those articles from African countries. They are really concerned about if this would be combined with One Belt, One Road, all those kind of projects to advance China's interests. And also another big concern I have on this is that when China said it's one party rule has worked well, the US has somehow followed China's model. In fact, all the national borders now are basically closed. Even during World War II, the US-Mexico border, US-Canada border was not closed. Now it's closed. And also the US has adopted those kind of Chinese state capitalist approach, try to strengthen industrial policy. Joe Biden just last week just ordered a review of the US strategic supplies, basically said we should more self-reliance, the Chinese did, to have redundant supplies to just for its own national security, and try to support some kind of industrial industries like China did. And also in the cyber space, China advocates cyber sovereignty. US tried to oppose that. Now US has also somehow come to that direction. This type of tendency I see very dangerous to the global collaboration for the global issue like this one.
I have questions coming in from the audience. I'll remind the group, if you're interested in jumping into this conversation with a question of your own, please hit the Q&A box and type in your question. And in the time we have remaining now, we'll convey some of those questions to both of our guests. I'm going to read two questions we've received together and let you kind of address them concurrently. One is, do you think there was an initial cover-up by the Chinese government? And then two, Xi Jinping made a big issue as to the significance of the Chinese CDC as the most efficient in the world. Chinese government touted their ability to detect the next infection very early, but in reality, their system did fail to detect the early course of this particular disease, allowing the pandemic to spread. Has there been any call to address that? Curious about going back in time and kind of your assessment of the beginning of the pandemic.
So I think Dr. Zhou should take the first question, and I'll take the China CDC question.
Okay, there was a cover-up for sure. The whole thing started December and maybe late November. And the Chinese doctor, and Li Liang, he was a whistleblower and was punished for publicizing this information for sure. However, this has to be put in the context of the new virus, very new. Nobody knew that. Nobody understood that. So it took a while for the Chinese government to understand this new virus. When they understood, knew how dangerous it is, I think they took very quick actions and shared information with WHO, with the US and other countries at that point. So I will blame China for its initial cover-up, but also I press for China for what they did after they realized that. Compare that, see, if we put a comparison for the United States. For quite a while, US, I will not say cover-up, but US took such a relaxed position. In New York City, for example, I remember those press conference by the mayor and the governor say, oh, don't worry, nothing serious, just like flu. We have the best, I remember that news press, we have the best medical facilities in New York City in the world. So we'll handle that easy. But see what happened. Now US is the epicenter and we are still not out of the woods yet. So that's what I would put in the context.
So really good points. Thank you. So I think on the China CDC question is that it is the central main equivalent to our CDC. In fact, they changed their name to take on the CDC name because of the function. But China's CDC system is decentralized. The national center is in Beijing, and they work on more of a federated, independent, autonomous regional system. So the provincial autonomous region CDC is not tied to the main national CDC. They have to work on a very collaborative way. And so the information does not necessarily immediately flow straight up and is owned by the government. It is still a negotiated piece, if you will. And the China CDC has good techniques and good ability to do so, but the whole infrastructure is very complex. And in the US, it is complex. We ourselves don't even have a national system for reporting virus variants at this very moment when the need is greatest. We just have not invested in it. China has invested a lot in the China CDC. The scientists also know their work, but they're also hamstrung, as Sam said, is that a new virus you don't know from the noise. And you don't know until much, much later, retrospectively, that something happened. And often that's the case. And so I think even the earliest signal that WHO really is asking now for China to turn over a cluster of similar cases from September 2019 that had all the markings of what essentially is what we know now is the SARS coronavirus or the COVID disease. And that those records are not being shared with WHO or anyone else. And that might tell us a little bit better or focus us better on the origins of this virus. And until the scientists have access to that as a global sharing, we would remain in question as to the origin of this virus, right? But we know that it's not manipulated, it's a natural virus, because any manipulated virus that might be intentionally released usually would be like in the US, as you well know from TV shows, the bullets that they have these striations. You can see the marks on a manipulated virus genome, and there is none.
Excellent, thank you. I'm gonna read a question for both of you following up on the conversation we had a few minutes ago about COVAX. So the audience member says, I agree with Dr. Zhao's rather critical assessment of the global response. And I also agree with Dr. Chus' assessment that COVAX offers some hope. However, COVAX and other current global response is so limited, 12% as you mentioned, that it's hugely inadequate as a response to this pandemic. Is there evidence that learning is taking place from these fledgling and early global efforts that suggest a more effective response to future global challenges, such as additional and future pandemics and global climate change might exist? And do you see the possibility that the US and China might learn from this and collaborate more closely next time around?
Dr. Chu, want to?
Pull out your crystal ball from your desk, and where do we go from here?
Sure, we'll have to see. The governments have to see politically they have advantages if they join together, right? And if we set ourselves up in adversarial roles, it's going to be harder to overcome. And so I think COVAX, though, is small and can be criticized for limiting the resources to public good, is a good start. It's better than not having anything. Whether it's going to accomplish all the things it needs to do, probably not, because the pandemic is different in the sense that every country is suffering from some kind of COVID response, and they have to, of course, take care of their own people before they can widely share. And so it's unusual. In the Ebola outbreaks that I've worked on, generally it's a few countries over there, right? And so it's easy to amass resources and donate it for that. And it's because you don't have to deal with expenditures in your country. We're in a very different place we've never been before, that we are responding to something so demanding of our own resources, how much of that can be used. And in fact, that we are thinking about providing even 12% or to commit some funding towards an international coalition is a good start. I don't say that there's a solution, and I don't say that we can predict pandemics in the future, but this type of work can build trust, and trust can build some sharing. It's never going to be clear and open because it's just our nature.
I agree with Dr. Chu's assessment. It's good to have a COVAX type of multilateral efforts. But the world today has going against this direction. And not only because now everyone is suffering, they have to take care of their own business. The liberal globalization which supposed to produce global collaboration on this type of issues, have under attack, under backlash, under sliding in last decade. And people have been concerned. The concern is not for the public goods, it's for themselves. They concern about inequality because of those kind of global process have not produced equal consequences, which cannot be. So that's the problem. Sovereignty, sovereign state, and national self-interests have put a lot of constraints on this. The global climate change issue is similar. How many countries are willing to put all those caps to emission neutral? And China for quite a while said China will do it, but then China did not do it. They emphasized that the developed countries should take more shares, pay more because you polluted the world first. So we developing countries suffered in the process. So we should not pay the same thing. Now the Paris climate accord signed 2015, then US get out. Now US is returned, but how much each country would willing to put constraints on themselves. President Xi Jinping last September pledged the world 2060, China would have emission neutral. But many people said by 2050 is a critical moment already. So this kind of commitment to make a sacrifice for the global goods, that's the problem today for the world.
Let me go back now to where do we go from here type question. Dr. Chu, towards the end of your presentation, slides introduced preventative measures and awareness that were taken by the Chinese government. And an audience member asks if both of you can expand on time for implementation of some of these measures. And if you can share with us other measures that were taken in China with the time frame or scientific support for measures, for instance, monitoring of wet markets, effective digital application of trace of exposures, classification of various communities by risk levels as well.
So the wet markets, there is a law, a new law, regulation that was put in place after the Wuhan wet market was closed as supposedly the place where the SARS coronavirus came out of. It is clear now that the wet market was but a passing through of that virus, and that virus had come from someplace else. So I think some of these measures are going to take a while to implement, but what is really changed in the shift in paradigm in China that I see in this outbreak versus the 2003 SARS outbreak and subsequent other influenza pandemic-like responses is that China is now aggressively in the medical countermeasures market. It is good for us globally, that is us, because we'll have access to their technology, some of the technologies and some of the testing capabilities and therapeutics and other kinds of materials like PPE. It is, in a way, puts pressure on a lot of other countries to respond. China has not yet fully embraced the international regulatory standards for drugs, vaccines, and diagnostic kits. So some of these are pushed aggressively, but are of a lesser quality than we would accept in the West. So that's going to take a while to implement because it's a cultural shift. You know, and if you remember in China, they've been known to have these potentially devastating export of food that's contaminated and they supplemented with plastics and others instead of protein. The milk powder scandal some years ago, all this are things that is culturally shifting in China. So I would say that in a few years, China will be able to implement a lot of these higher standards very quickly. And we would be dealing with that kind of commercial market economic competition more so than the medical front.
I agree with Dr. Chu here. And for the future, I think there are two levels of games here. One is micro level, the other is macro level. Micro, each country, China, US, and also many European countries, we have to put our own house in order. In China, as Dr. talked about, transparency issue is a big issue. And the government takes responsibility, and the government should be responsive to the crisis and domestic issues. The Chinese government for quite a while, this transparency issue is insecurity. The government, when they start, why they had that kind of cover up to a great extent was afraid, insecurity, afraid of this will create a domestic legitimacy crisis or global backlash, all those problems. I still remember when this took place, the cover up, the Chinese liberals, Xu Zhiyong and Tsinghua University was his name. These people just said that all these were the problem caused by the centralization of power by Xi Jinping, all those domestic issues. So this has to be overcome. There should be domestic reform in the US, also American democracy, American society, American leadership, domestic, also there's not a problem should be resolved before these two big powers could do better. At macro level, I think the global environment is very bad at this time, especially the rivalry between US and China. This kind of rivalry is going to damage a lot of problems. These two countries really have to find a way to understand the rising power and the incumbent power are not only going to so-called distance trap, having war. They still have a lot of shared interests, especially in the 21st century. Like we talk about the global climate change, the pandemic, the weapons of mass destruction, transnational crimes, all those things. These two countries have to take responsibilities and find ways to work together. I mean, the technology front now is another issue here. We will see two ecosystems. This is horrible, this kind of situation. In this pandemic, this kind of vaccines, we also might see two ecosystems, they compete. So this is the big, this is a global kind of macro level of environment, which is not kind of inducive to find solution to these problems. So we have to find ways.
I want to ask a question, but we've come up on time. So I'm going to offer an editorial sentence or two as a launching point to the next program. Perhaps we organize collaboratively amongst our three institutions. We are all part of the higher education community as well. And I think as higher educators, researchers, scholars, student staff, faculty, and the communities that we serve, we have a role and an opportunity to advance solutions, both regarding some of the geopolitical issues that we've talked about today, and certainly on the scientific issues that have been discussed. So I offer that as an idea for the next program. How can higher education and those of us speaking today but participating in this session be a part of the solution and be part of the world that we want to see collectively moving forward? With that, let me offer a virtual expression of gratitude to both of you for all your insightful and thoughtful comments in this fabulous conversation. For all the audience members, once this session ends, you're going to go to a screen and a button that says continue will be there. Please hit that button. That'll take you to a survey to let us know about this session. We really welcome your feedback on all of these sessions with the International Symposium. This session has been recorded, will be available on our website through YouTube in a few days. Encourage you all to binge watch our entire International Symposium later this spring. Share with your friends, neighbors, students, and colleagues as you like. Our next session with the International Symposium starts in 30 minutes. It's called A Burning World, and it'll tackle the increased wildfire activity globally, climate change, and the cost of human health and society. And then at 1:30 Mountain Time this afternoon, Ambassador Ryan Crocker will be our closing keynote speaker, speaking on the future of diplomacy. It's going to be a fantastic session, as this one was as well. With that, thank you, Dr. Zhao. Thank you, Dr. Chu. Thank you to all of our attendees today. Have a great day, and thank you for being part of our session today.